And welcome to the Real Squabble. I'm Mike Burnett, and today we're going to talk about gender transition surgeries. They're extremely controversial. It's an extremely controversial area and a part of a complex web of issues that Kevin Harris is going to bring up for us and run us through today. But before we jump in, let me remind you to follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Real Squabble. Kevin, what do you have for us today?
There is there are so many layers to transgenderism and to the whole what people call a transgender movement across the country. It's certainly been front and center um, on all the networks. Happened to run across Chris Rock doing his newest routine. He half of his whole routine is about transgenderism. Obviously, it's a popular topic right now, extremely controversial. One more thing that tends to sharply divide us as Americans, and I'm looking from the aspect of the church as well. Our first reaction is love, and
Hmm.
what can we do to be there for someone who has any kind of struggle, issue, or confrontation with transgender feelings, which is basically um, uh, you feel like that you are not the gender that you were assigned at birth, that you were born with. You're born a male, but you don't feel like that you're a male. You feel like you're supposed to be a female. What is um, and it's often called uh, gender dis,
Dysphoria, right?
uh, dysphoria,
Hmm.
dysfunction,
Hmm.
dystopia, all those dys
Hmm.
words. Um, Gender dysphoria, that means a person has a conflict internally with what sex they are, whether they're male or female. And this has exploded. And some of the things that I'll also bring to the table is that there's been this rush across the nation to legislate this issue and to bring about legislation on
Hmm.
both sides to prevent it from happening to minors and to those who are saying, do not prevent this. This is impinging on someone's rights, and so on. Um, One of the first things that I would say about that, and then I'll uh, open up to the panel because I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, and that is, I've always been taught that we shouldn't legislate in extremes. Don't legislate on extremes. Um, as an example, there's a person who has a harsh psychological reaction to the color red.
Hmm.
And so they call their local legislator and say, we got to change all stop signs and we
Hmm.
can't have red lights anymore.
Hmm.
It throws me into a tizzy. And so
Triggers me.
legislation goes into effect that says no stop signs and no stoplights can be red
Hmm.
because it disturbs some people. And I'm stretching it out so we can see it. I mean, that's pretty extreme, right?
Right.
But you don't legislate on extremes. You're going to say, what percentage of people would this really be a problem with? And it's so infinitesimally small that it would be a waste of time and actually counterproductive to try to enact legislation based on such a small portion of people who are affected by this thing. And in a lot of ways, transgenderism and gender dystopia, dysphoria, is like that because there's such a small amount of people who deal with this issue. And it is a struggle for a lot of people, but I see this possibly as being an exercise in legislating in extremes. But activists will jump all over this because they have a bigger agenda. Both sides of the aisle will do this. They see this as a political football that we can utilize here. And so we got to get legislation going. Most of the legislation that's been going on is to prevent um, radical surgeries, medical procedures on minors, on children. Oklahoma is trying to pass this right now, and they say you cannot make up your mind about whether or not you're going to have this radical surgery that's going to make you more female or more male
Hmm.
until you're 26 years old. Reason being is research shows that our brains are not fully developed until 26, and we make bad decisions. And that really explains a lot. Some of the stupid things I did at 21 and 22, it makes a real, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
But now the legislators who introduced this bill in Oklahoma, they knew they weren't going to get that number, but they did do it to show that, hey, you could get radical surgery or medical procedures and then regret it, and then change your mind and say, I wish I hadn't done this. I was
Hmm.
13 and thought, I wanted to be a boy. And my parents succumbed to some of the activism that they've heard and some of the rhetoric that they've heard. And now I'm altered forever. And so that's one aspect that is very sad about this, is that some things can happen that will not, they can't be reversed. Does anybody, you guys have anything, what do you think about my example of legislating by extremes? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I really think it does, Kevin. Because what we can do is we can jump from one thing to the other too quickly without thinking it through, without having proper research and good data and understanding. Try and that's key right there is understanding, trying to understand what is happening and who the person is, and what they're going through, because you may or may not know mentally, psychologically, what is going through. Now, if you use your example, there are some in that spectrum who would consider themselves fluid. One day they could think the sign is red, and one day they could think it was green, and one day it's you use the word feel about 10 times when you were opening, and that's kind of where you're keyed in there a little bit. But there is a reality too, is that they are experiencing things. They're experiencing things psychologically that are real to them, and they could come about because of a variety of reasons that we can discuss as we go along. But I can imagine, that these folks are not unlike us. They want to be in that. They want to be accepted. They want to be accepted. They want to be loved, and regardless, you were talking about a Christian perspective, and I think also just as a civil human, loving perspective, that we could do our best to try to support and love people that are different from us, um, because I can't imagine that this is not distressful to them at some level.
Of course it is. Yeah. And it just occurred to me that, do you realize that there are, strict guidelines and things on plastic surgery, that the plastic surgeon will really go through some procedures with you to see if there's not some underlying mental or psychological issue that you have that makes you want to keep changing your face? After you have nose surgery 3 times, 2 or 3 times, you start to damage your nasal cavity. And the doctor, any self-respecting doctor, would say, no, stop this.
Right.
Now you can always find some quack to do it, but some people keep having these surgeries because they can't quite get it right, and their nose is still too big. Well, the mirror is fooling them. They just have a body image with this thing, and they need some counseling. They don't need more surgery that's going to be irreversible and damage them. Yet, when it comes to changing your
Mhm.
sex. And as Ellen Page removed her breasts,
Mhm.
uh, and then these hormone treatments come in and change your body forever. Everybody's saying, yeah, come on. Yeah, you need to do that. And so I smell activism when that
Yeah.
happens. Let's hurry up and get some poster children for our movement. Um, and I think Ellen Page, who is now Elliot Page, I think that's very sad. And she's very young. She could live to regret what she has done to her body. You know, um,
Yeah, I don't doubt it, Kevin. And the thing is, right, there is no real. I've been listening to a number of psychologists from national health centers, in Europe and the United States, and there is really no good solid data on why people do what they do, when they're doing it, and why there are certain groups that are doing that are transitioning or detransitioning as much as they are. But there's interesting information out there to think about that Dr. Miller may be able to address. He just joined us uh, from Wyoming. Thank you. Welcome to the show, The Real Squabble. But it's interesting. Maybe you can shed some light on this. But it seems like about 75% of the people that are transitioning or detransitioning were female at birth, right? And many of them had, what do you call them? Comorbidities. They were on an autism spectrum. They suffer from depression and anxiety and had a lot of other things going on in their life that could have and should have probably been addressed alongside it before major life changing decisions were made. And I listened to probably a half a dozen or so people who detransitioned, that came back, and they would say things like, I wasn't really in the state of mind to give consent. I wasn't really psychologically well, but I did this at that time and I regretted it. Now, I don't know that everyone regrets it, but I would imagine that, as we talked about earlier, that they do want to be accepted. They feel like they will um, do better as a man or do better as a woman, and some of them transfer back because, believe it or not, the guys who transfer back uh, bring up points about being um, being abused or uh, discriminated against, or a lot of them talk about being sexually abused as children. And there's a lot of trauma involved that hasn't been investigated or talked about.
You bring up some really great points there, Mike. Sorry for being late this morning. Um, when you look at the psychiatric literature, somewhere between 50 and 90% of people who, as adolescents, express desires to transition, if they're given support and encouragement and help to delve into these psychological issues you're talking about, between 50 and 90% of them end up reverting back to their gender of birth. Um, I remember it was I think in 22 or 21 or 22, 60 Minutes did a piece on gender affirming medicine and spent half of the piece talking about these so-called detransitioners. And Leslie Stahl ended up having to do a follow-up piece where she was essentially saying, hey, look, I'm not trying to bash the transgendered community. I'm just trying to give a balanced view of this very difficult topic. And so what's fascinating is Europe is probably 10 or 15 years ahead of us in gender affirming medicine. And what's interesting in Europe is that many, if not most, of the major uh, gender affirming treatment centers, such as the Karolinska Center and in most of the UK and other places, have stopped doing gender affirming medicine on anyone under the age of 18. And part of the reasoning for that is they noticed that as these people were transitioning, Their rates of mental illness didn't improve. Their rates of suicide didn't improve. And so there was actually a huge lawsuit in England that went all the way to their high court, where the court ended up ruling that no one under the age of 16 had the legal capability of giving consent to this type of treatment, and people between the age of 16 and 18 were, kind of iffy on a case by case basis.
Right. I think they had to do puberty blockers first, and then they had to do that for a year before they were allowed to do any transition.
Well, but even to go through those types of treatments, though, they said that they weren't able to give consent for these things. And so, when you look at the guidelines that WPATH and these other transgender medical societies have put forth, the guidelines include rigorous psychological analysis and screening, which should include so-called gender exploratory psychotherapy, which is helping someone to figure out, are they having these transgendered feelings because they have genuine, true gender dysphoria that needs to be treated medically, or are they simply a confused, depressed adolescent who's trying to work out issues of homosexuality or whatever in what they consider to be a safe way, so they don't feel like they can safely come out and say, I'm a gay man. But what they can do is they can say, I'm a transgendered female, and then I can act out on my on my urges. And then instead of helping them to work through that, we just say, okay, well, let's give you medicine, let's give you surgery, and do things that are not easily undone, if undoable at all.
So we don't even think about whether or not they were abused as children, or what other traumas or psychological things that they're going through, right?
And in fact, oftentimes, if you try and ask those questions, then you're met with this huge defensive posture that, as you or Kevin alluded to, really suggests more of an agenda than it does seeking to provide appropriate medical care.
Kevin brought up, you said it was under the 25, right?
Kevin brought up what? Say again.
I thought you said, I mean, the vast majority of these folks are under the age of 25, right?
No, what I was saying was that the Oklahoma bill to prevent these kind of procedures on minors, they proposed that you can't make that decision until you're 26 years old. The authors of the bill, they knew they wouldn't get that number until you're 26, because the brain is not developed fully, according to some research, until you're 26. And so the point being is, don't make a decision that you're going to regret, or potentially regret. Some of this is irreversible. And I wonder, Dr. Miller, if these puberty blockers, which seems to be the most benign of some of the procedures, is that still, I mean, that delays puberty until maybe 15 or 16.
And there's some honest debate in the medical community about how permanent some of the puberty blocking medicines can be, and then from there you progress to the so-called cross-sex hormones. So you start by giving an adolescent, if they're biologically male, you give them puberty blockers to stop male puberty from onsetting, and then you give them female hormones to create more of a feminine body appearance and more of a feminine development. And so there's a lot of debate in the literature about how permanent the effect of some of these treatments can be. The fact that there's this debate and that this is not a settled and a known phenomenon in the minds of many people, including many transgendered individuals who are themselves transgendered healthcare providers, is creating an abundance of caution. And so some of the people that Leslie Stahl was interviewing on 60 Minutes are transgendered physicians providing gender affirming care who are themselves transgendered. And they're the ones who are raising some of the loudest notes of caution, and at the same time are being vilified and criticized by members of their own transgender community.
Dave, did you just testify on this? Is that my understanding? Were you
Yeah, I
called to
offered.
testify?
So Idaho, the state of Idaho, is passing a bill that would outlaw gender affirming medicine in minors, which would include both medical and surgical gender affirming care. And so, yeah, on behalf of the American Academy of Medical Ethics, I've offered testimony in support of this ban. So a lot of the material I'm talking about this morning came from preparation for that testimony.
I wanted to jump in real quick here. I had an opportunity to chat with a young transgender fella, and this was several months ago before I knew this topic was going to come up. But one of the interesting parts of our conversation was asking him about this new spotlight that he felt was on the as a trans male, the new spotlight that is on this transgender thing. And the interesting thing that he said was he didn't want to be part of the spotlight, and that he felt like there were a lot of people who just wanted to join a cool club that really wasn't, that they had no part really of anything, except that this is a new cool thing that some cool people are doing, and they want to be part of it. And I'm way over dramatizing that, but can you speak to that, Doctor?
I hear that exactly. I have two teenagers in high school, and we're in a small, rural, very conservative community in Idaho, and that's exactly what I hear from my kids in high school. Is that there are a number of kids who are coming out as gay or bisexual or transgendered or whatever, but you look at how they're actually living their life, and they're not really doing anything any different from anyone else. They're just adopting a label that places them in a cool club with some cool kids that
Melissa, I see
has
you.
very little to do with their identity.
I see Melissa nodding her head like this. So
Yes.
speak to it.
Gonna follow up. Yeah, I mean, I think as some of the panelists know who I've been on here before with, I did a lot of years in college campus ministry. And so this is obviously a very relevant daily issue and topic with working with college age students in that environment. And there were, in fact, there was basically an environment that did encourage, this kind of coming out sort of thing, this sort of being different, trying, like there were, for instance, we have like coming out day, and it was just kind of this day for everyone who was, had some kind of sexual identity change or change in their gender identity to kind of make that pronouncement. And it was like kind of embraced as like this very big day of courage and that. But again, in these debates, there's just so much that's missed and with those who have the agenda, and even within the church, because we miss out just a huge opportunity to have bigger discussions about what is gender, what is sexuality, what is parenting, what is mothering and fathering. Are these important distinctions that should even be made, or is it just obsolete? So, again, as Christians, there can be just this knee-jerk rejection and reaction to where we miss opportunities to really have discussions about our worldview and culture, right? And then also to speak into the lives of people who are suffering, who are dealing with these issues on a daily basis, and who do feel displaced in some way, and we can affirm their humanity in their struggles, right? We can frame this as we are affirming your humanity, as opposed to denying, trying to get you to deny who you are, but we actually care about you as a person, as an individual, and we want to hear your story and make some connections. And many of my experiences, there was, issues of abuse, or there were issues of a parent that was absent, a same-sex parent that was absent, or things, a rejection within the family dysfunction unit, some sort of dysfunction, and things that we can walk with people through rather than just discounting their feelings and experiences, but just kind of get to know them where they are and understand how they got to this point. Because I guarantee you there's a process to them getting to this point of actually coming out as transgender.
There is an issue I want to bring up that I think now comes up uh, in this conversation. And I've got a stack of articles that I've been trying to go through from media sources, and the suicide card is front and center. You've got to let these 13-year-olds, 12-year-olds have radical surgery and procedures, because if you don't, they will commit suicide. And the president of the American Psychological Association said that. And then mainstream media will get on that. And they're a little more liberal. And because, whoa, if you say these kids are going to commit suicide, that's a conversation stopper. How am I supposed to argue with that? We don't want that.
Mm.
You know, one person testified in Nebraska. There's,
that
go ahead.
Yeah.
There's let me give you this here.
Well, no, I mean, that's an extremely salient point, but go ahead and finish your thought, Kevin.
One person who spoke in support of a Nebraska bill that they are trying to prevent these procedures from happening to minors and so on. They've already got this legislation going. And a person testified that their parents were coerced into the surgery. They were told, would you rather have a dead daughter or a living son?
Mm-hmm.
And then this person who's deeply regretting the surgery that she had, these are not the words of a medical professional, but the words of an activist. I was just a teenager who needed actual help, not surgery.
Mm.
Go ahead, Dr. Miller.
Right. So Sweden actually proposed a bill that would lower the age of consent for gender affirming care to 15 because of this issue. And then that prompted the publishing of a series of documentaries highlighting the plight of these young detransitioners who had gone through surgical transition for this very reason. And this was part of what highlighted the fact that if you have kids that are suicidal, that suicidality needs to be dealt with. The fact that you do these life-changing medical treatments and surgical treatments on them does not address their suicidality, and they're just as likely, if not more than likely, to be suicidal after this fact. And so, yeah, that's something that gets thrown out there because it's this big, huge, emotionally charged statement. So if it's going to cause kids to commit suicide, we have to act on that. But as a medical professional who deals with, as a physician who deals with kids with mental illness on a regular basis, that's not how you deal with mental illness. You don't deal with someone who's claiming to be suicidal, and if you don't let me do X, I want to commit suicide. That's not how you properly deal with that situation. You help them to deal with the root of their suicidality, which is not, I feel like I need to have gender transition surgery. There's something deeper that's causing that, and that's what you have to deal with. And so when you look at the WPATH guidelines, that's supposedly part of the guidelines for vetting someone for gender affirming care, is that you've dealt with all these psychological comorbidities and you've stripped away all the issues of depression and anxiety and other things that are causing these feelings, and you're left with the fact that this is just simply a person that has profound gender dysphoria and needs to be treated. As it stands now, what typically happens is they meet with a counselor. You say you're transgendered. Okay. They have 1 or 2 sessions. You're transgendered. Let's move forward. And there's no delving into any of these deep issues at all. And that's exactly what some of these transgendered care providers are reacting and responding to, is the fact that these kids' baseline mental illnesses are being ignored in lieu of this agenda that the transgender community is putting forth.
I apologize for not having the source on this, but I just read a statistic. I can rifle through it and find it. That in fact, early research is you're 19% more likely to commit suicide after some of these gender transitional procedures. And so if suicide is your
Absolutely.
issue, well, then you need to look at the one statistic, at least, and this is such an early issue, it seems that we still need some research on it. But one is uncovered that you're almost 20% more likely to commit suicide
Mhm.
if you do this. So we can't be throwing around the suicide card. Anybody can use that. That's just a conversation stopper. It's an attempted conversation stopper.
Coercion.
Yeah.
Hey, Kevin,
So,
I think
yeah.
if I could jump in real quick, I think that we have
Yeah,
to be very
yeah.
careful about all of the information that we consume that's out there, regardless of the authorities who are saying it. Because as a person who has a number of friends and family members in doctoral and graduate programs for psychology and have read many of the textbooks and listened online to a number of the psychologists, I can tell you right now that a lot of it is being written by social justice activists or activists of some type who are trying to program the future generation, not really to diagnose it in a fair and balanced way, but to fully diagnose it in their very personal slant, activist slant on the issue.
Jackie, you may want to speak to this. We need to be very precise in our language, I think. But language, whoever can get control of that can use it as to their rhetorical advantage. And Mike, that's what you're talking about. You have to see through, read between the lines. All of us have to do this um, on what's being said. But headline after headline after headline that I'm looking through is things like transgender children denied care, transgender children targeted for the prevention of them receiving gender affirming care. And you're going, who are these
What?
Nazis that are denying these kids or targeting these kids? So when you start using, even though it's actually technically targeting children, denying care, and that's just in the medical community as well, Dr. Miller, that a care. That's what it's called. But boy, when you put that all together, it makes you. It's really a rhetorical hammer to do that and then add suicide. What do you think?
Well, then it comes back to me. It comes back to the old adage: it's not what you say, it's how you say it.
Yeah.
And so language is very important, I believe, in this, because I'm going to go ahead and maybe be the pot stirrer, maybe not. We'll see how this goes. But I'm just going to throw a couple of things out there. One, and I don't have the answer to this question. Dave, you may. But when did all of this start? When did all of the sudden, because that's how it kind of feels for a lot of us, when did this become, quote unquote, an issue? And when I say that, I'm going to bring back a couple of things that have been said in here just in the last 33 minutes. One thing that was said was that, wanting to be loved and accepted, that's important. And I am not, by any means, let me make this very clear, I am not bashing on anybody. All right. But wanting to be loved and accepted is not the sole property of any one group.
Right.
That's a basic human need that we all have. But now it's becoming the property of one sole group. That's a problem. When did it become so controversial to tell a minor, to tell a child, no? When did that happen? You can't drive until you're a certain age. You can't marry, you can't drink, you can't sign a contract, you can't. And I know I was one of those teenagers that was like, I'm going to hold my breath until you let me get my license. But I didn't throw the suicide card. But now it seems, since you brought that up, that card is being used very indiscriminately.
Yes.
On both sides. it is being used indiscriminately. So, in answer to your question, does language matter? Oh, yeah, it does. And I think the narrative, and I don't know what the end game is for activists that are using a negative language to scare, or whatever term you want to use. I don't know what the end game is there, but you're targeting children, and I don't like it.
Well, we know from the pro-life movement and the abortion debate, activists on both sides said, okay, quit using these terms. Let's use these terms.
Right.
Don't say anti-abortion, say pro-life. Let's not say pro-abortion. Let's say pro-choice. That has a better rhetorical ring and will reach the people in the middle potentially, better. We have to be able to see through that, all of us. And it's kind of disingenuous, like you were saying,
I want to hop in here real quick. As a parent, my kids are now adults, but as a parent, when my children ask me, "Can I have a tattoo? Can I have a piercing?" So I just told them.
Oh, you're gonna get Melissa all worked up.
Yeah. So
have that piercing.
So yeah. So I will tell you, my 28-year-old, when she was 21, did get a septum and a nose ring, but I said, no, you can't have a tattoo until you're 18. You've got to be able. I'm not going to be the one that signs off on this, so you can come back on me and say, look, you let me do this when I was a kid. No. You got to make that as an adult. So if you want to make adult decisions, you got to be an adult. And so if they have tattoos, all three of my kids have tattoos. My son doesn't have any piercings, but my daughter Angelica just has one on each ear. Zoe's got the septum and the nose ring, and probably 3 or 4 on one side, and but they were adults when they made that decision.
Yes.
And Jackie, the issue does seem it's been around for a while, but it seems to have intensified the last 2 or 3 years. And I wonder why our gay friends are so
partly
interested.
answer Jackie's question.
Yeah. Why are our gay friends so interested? Why is the gay community interested in this issue?
No, sorry.
Why is the gay community so interested in this in this issue?
Yeah. See, you bring up a second really interesting point. There, Kevin. But so the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH, this is kind of the large global organization that kind of makes policy in this area. Dates back to the 70s. It was founded in 79. What I find interesting, as Jackie pointed out, is this issue of transgender medicine really only has become an issue in the public eye within the last maybe 5 years. What's fascinating is in Europe, this debate has been going on for a much longer time. And really in America, it's become an issue mostly in the realm of athletics and transgendered athletics participation. And that's been, that's an ongoing, almost melodrama at times, with lots of NCAA sports saying, no, you can't participate. You have to participate in the gender of your birth, and other sports or other places are saying, no, you have to let them compete. One of the World Boxing Organizations is actually toying with the idea of creating a separate category, a separate competitive category for transgendered athletics. But more to the point that Kevin brought up is this whole issue of transgenderism in the gay community, which I have been fascinated to see how that has become an extremely divisive issue, particularly in the realm of athletics. So you look at people like Martina Navratilova, world famous tennis player, has been an active, outspoken lesbian athlete, an active advocate for gay and lesbian athletics for decades, and she comes out saying it makes absolutely no sense to allow biological males to compete against biological females, and all of a sudden she's ostracized. Mm-hmm. She's kicked out. J.K. Rowling, comes out, again, has been a strong advocate of gay rights for most of her professional life. She comes out saying this makes absolutely no sense to allow biological males to compete against biological females. And she's not only ostracized, she's ostracized from the Harry Potter community, which is kind of fascinating. And then people are like, well, how can you live with yourself? She's like, I just cash my royalty checks and go to bed just fine. I mean, she really, it's this whole notion of getting into a Twitter war with a world famous author is kind of funny to me. Do you really think you're going to write something better than her? So again, I think this lack of a desire for reasoned debate speaks to this whole issue of there being an agenda that's being put forth, and no one really wants to have a debate on that side of things.
Well, there's again, to return to what we mentioned at the beginning of the program, that is that there is a rush right now from both sides of this issue to get legislation passed. We got to hurry. We got to hurry. We got to hurry. And a lot of these states, 17, 18, 19, I lost count, they're having this legislation, that are proposing this legislation and passing this legislation, are doing so as if they want to stay ahead of the activists. And that there's so much activism and there's noise and fury on this right now that we need to hurry up and get this in place to prevent, something, these procedures that people are going to regret, that kids are going to regret when they're adults and things like that. And I heard some conservative activists in Texas say, we've got to hurry up, get this legislation passed, or the state will bypass the parents and do these procedures to minors, and things like that. That's the fear. And that stirs up a lot of fear and anxiety. Oh my goodness, they're trying to bypass even the parents because, they see the parents as clueless, standing in the way. Let's get these kids, fixed so they'll be happy and won't commit suicide, and get their parents out of the way. Do it behind their parents' back if we have to. I don't know.
We're seeing rare little incidences like this, that sort of almost harken back to, and Melissa will know this, harken back to the old days of the secret abortion van going from the high school. And I think that there are small isolated cases where the courts have intervened and said, no, you have to allow this to happen. And that, regardless of what side of the issue you're on, anyone who understands anything about medicine, if you're sitting here allowing the courts to decide on what is at its heart a controversial medical issue, I mean, in 2020, I mentioned the case in Great Britain. In 2020, it was the London Royal Court of Justice in the Bell versus Tavistock case. They ruled, this ruling is really fascinating, that youth under the age of 16 were incapable of providing informed consent. Between 16 and 18, they were, maybe on a case-by-case basis, but the court also opined that the lack of high-quality research in this topic suggested that medical treatments for transgender youth were best characterized as experimental in nature. And here we're having the courts intervene saying, no, you should be able to do this no matter what. So the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, this is one of the world leaders in gender affirming care. They provided some of the very first gender reassignment surgeries back in the day. They stopped doing gender affirming care on adolescents under the age of 18 unless they were enrolled in a properly vetted research protocol. And so that's where physicians are really getting involved and getting all worked up, is the fact that there are more questions than we've even known to ask about that, all these long-term effects. Again, Europe is about 10, 15 years ahead of us in this area, and their experience is causing them to have pause. And our lack of experience is causing us to rush forward. It's a Dunning-Kruger type moment.
Wow. Wow. Well, that's the point. We all need to take a deep breath. There's so much noise and fury on this right now, so much research that needs to happen. And the last thing our transgender friends need is for us to redneck out on them. Let it be a foregone conclusion. And Mike, I'm sure that you
identify with that remark.
I'm sorry to discriminate against the rednecks,
Yeah,
but
thanks.
but Mike, I think it's a foregone conclusion that we're not here to. We may squab a little bit, but we're not here to bash. We're here to be
No.
compassionate. But obviously, there are going to be people who just go, "Man alive, what's wrong with these people?"
Yeah,
And
but don't say it with a southern accent.
I know.
sorry,
Us hillbillies, we take offense to that
Yeah.
to some
I hear it on a
degree.
daily basis.
Okay, I realize you're in Texas, and under your desk there's a pistol. But hey, let me jump in and just
And there's a problem
readdress
with
one
that?
one area that I wanted to touch base on is when did it start happening? Why did it start happening? I think that politics has become very dirty in the last decade or two, right? And maybe it's driven a lot more by social media, our ever-present news cycles, the way we divided up the news with, you know, Fox in bed with conservatives, MSNBC in bed with liberals. Everybody's in a category, and I think it would be smart to do some reading and maybe even check the real squabble discussion on neo-Marxism. I think that it's a complex issue. There's a lot of people that are acting and reacting and not knowing why, but there are things afoot of people that are trying to be activists and change things for political reasons. And they do try to divide us. One of the reasons we started this is so that we could squabble and show people that it was okay to squabble and it was okay to disagree without and still being friends. Most of us have been friends for a long time. We don't agree on everything.
Yeah.
But that there are historical Marxist, neo-Marxist reasons why people want to divide people into victims and villains. Because if we can divide you by race and sex and gender and whatever you want to call it, you can stop just loving everyone as humans, like Melissa said earlier. And regardless of your faith, and many of us are Christians, we would say that we're driven to show people the love of Christ. Well, that means something. That means a way of doing something that isn't hostile, that isn't hurting people, but is looking for answers. And we don't always have the answers. We can't come off like that because we don't. We can talk about it. We can think about it. Continue to show love and support, but also realize, without being a conspiracy theorist, that there are real political people that are trying to make things happen that you don't want to happen.
Yeah.
Whether you're aware of them or not.
Yeah. I know that I'm kind of contradicting myself by being insensitive to rednecks, but it's kind of hard to define what a redneck is. But one of the main things about a redneck is that they're insensitive and irrational. So it's more of a nebulous thing. I'm not picking on. I'm
no, well, truly, Kevin, I refer to myself more as a hillbilly than a redneck. But context always matters, and I know from you, it's always from a heart of love.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to ask Dr. Miller, since he came in after we brought this up, we were talking about legislating by extremes, that there is such a small amount of people who deal with this. Why this rush for all this major legislation? And my understanding, Dave, is that it's like less than 1% of the population that deal with gender dysphoria.
Right. We're seeing kind of this artificial inflation of numbers right now, which I think is slightly akin to the Kinsey report back in the 60s. And I think it's very much akin to the discussion we were having earlier about taking on a transgender label to be part of the cool club. But when you get down to it and really hash the brass tacks, people with genuine gender dysphoria is a vanishingly small part of the population. I think 1% is a reasonable estimate. And so it sort of begs the question, not begs, it sort of forces us to ask the question of why this rush to legislation. But at the same time, there's the social and sociologic forces that have to be taken into account, and that's the fact that Sally is going to come out as a transgendered male because it's a thing right now, and that's one of the things that's causing alarm for some people is this tremendous number of young biologic females that are coming out as transgendered males. And so a lot of people are sitting back scratching their heads trying to understand what that's about, because these are not all people that ought to be given gender affirming care. These are people that, for whatever reason, have issues that need to be addressed. They need to receive proper treatment and therapy. But I live in a state where quote unquote conversion therapy is banned. So to give me the care that's part of the WPATH recommended standard of care, which includes gender exploratory psychotherapy, is actually illegal in some states. So again, it's just this bizarre notion where you have activists on both sides, who are saying that, who are essentially vilifying the other side, and no one is able to come to the table and have a reasoned conversation about it, which I think is what's great about this show. Although we haven't had any chairs thrown yet, I'm still waiting for that.
A minute.
Oh, Jackie's picking up a chair. Watch out.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question of the panel. When I bring this up in the community that's I'm in Seattle, so we do not have any shortage of people who are sensitive to the pronouns, sensitive to the sexual orientation community. When I bring the surgery up, invariably we'll have a discussion that talks about Thailand being a decades-long place where this reassignment surgery has been done, and it is. I just wanted to open that up and see if is this a red herring when they bring that up, or is this a truly cured country?
Well, as they say, one night in Bangkok will make a hard man humble. So, I don't know that I would want to take that as a norm.
Right. Yeah. As a physician, what I can tell you about Thailand and much of Southeast Asia is a lot of the antibiotic resistant superbugs come from that part of the world. And part of the reason for that is because they have a largely unregulated medical system. And so you can go to the drugstore and buy any sort of medicine you want to buy. You can buy antibiotics, you can buy painkillers, you can do all kinds of things. So you think you have a cold, so you can take whatever outrageously powerful antibiotic you want to take. And so that causes all kinds of horrific downstream effects, which includes the generation of new superbugs. Mm-hmm. There are any number of places that you can go in the world to get any sort of unnecessary or even ill-advised and dangerous medical procedures done. The fact that you can go somewhere and do it is not an argument to suggest you should be able to go somewhere and do it. That would be akin to the fact that automatic weapons should be legal because you can go down somewhere else and you can buy them, so they just might as well be legal. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, let's make drugs legal. Let's make anything legal, because you can go there are places you can go to get anything. Yeah. So the fact that you can get it somewhere is not an argument that it should be legal.
Right.
I want to speak real quick, just, kind of, Mike, with, as you brought up neo-Marxism and, some of this groupthink mentality and this division that we see just embedded in everything, in every area of life, in academia, in science and medicine and sport. I mean, every area. And Kevin, when you brought up about with this rush to try to address the suicide issue, and I say this as someone who has been personally affected by, suicidal ideation in my past and had to deal with this. So I'm not insensitive in any way, and had a sibling who passed away via suicide. If we look at the real public health crisis as it relates to suicide, and we want to really address that issue, then we're going to have to start with addressing it within middle-aged white men. right? That's where your bulk of your suicides. That's who's committing suicide, right? For the overwhelming number majority, but they don't fit an agenda. Certain populations do. So we're going to use suicide as a way to manipulate, and to get our way, basically, right? That kind of fear mongering. And it just comes down to, it's just human nature to want to simplify things and to have this cookie cutter, very easy, so-called simplistic answers. But these simplistic answers that we create, these answers that create horrific emotional and all sorts of spiritual dynamics and issues on culture. So it's human nature to want to just solve things and put it in a little box and just say that we can just do this through medical procedures, in that. But when it relates to suicidal ideation and those sort of things, and you're dealing with profound mental, spiritual, emotional issues that have to be addressed for someone to overcome that. And I say that as someone who has had to overcome that. We're not even talking about like even the foods that we eat or the environment. All the different family dynamics, all of these different things that factor into these issues. But yeah, it's just inconvenient, and it doesn't fit that model of let's just divide and conquer, so to speak.
It's not simple. It's not simple. And we may, for marketing purposes, Dr. Dave, we may use your thing. We are not the Dunning-Kruger podcast. We are the real Squabble. So we humbly try to discuss these things. And what else have you got for us? We're getting close to the end here, Kevin.
Well, bottom line is that, I would say to our friends on the left, stop this rush to get these medical procedures done and to make them more available and to let them be performed, these life-altering, often irreversible procedures. Why the rush, guys? Why not? Let's take a deep breath and back up, because this may be, in fact, I would say it is, a counseling issue, not a surgical issue. You know what I mean? If a person is prone to suicide and if they have suicidal tendencies, they need some counseling care. And if they have gender dysphoria and they're struggling through their sexuality, in counseling, the first step, rather than, okay, here's my scalpel, cha 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 cha, but you've got a picture of Ellen Page now, for that all the social media is doing that, with her looking happy with no breast out by the pool. And so that's why I say activists often want to bypass and get to the real agenda. Bottom line is, and I would wonder what you would think, Dave, that this is first a counseling issue, then we can have better grounds upon which to make a decision on if we're going to do these surgical procedures or chemical procedures.
Absolutely. And again, based on the WPATH guidelines and standards of care, extended counseling and psychotherapy sessions are what are recommended by WPATH and the Endocrine Society and all these medical societies that develop standard of care for these issues. And for whatever reason, we have a lot of physicians in America that have decided to sidestep that and say, well, no, we just need to move forward because this is a thing. And it kind of, gets really, talking about the neo-Marxist angle that Mike mentioned a couple of times, it gets really hard to move away from the fact that this is a lot of just agenda motivated, and they're just trying to develop a body of constituents, because every transgendered person that you move through reassignment procedures is another member of your constituency. And so, they're not necessarily doing things in a way that would make us think otherwise. Yeah. Well, what I think is fascinating is, the poster child for quite some time in this area was Caitlyn Jenner. born Bruce Jenner, Mike and Kevin and Glenn and I and probably Jackie, and grew up watching him in the Olympics and, Wheaties box and all this kind of stuff. And then, all of a sudden, took this, quote unquote courageous step to leave the Kardashian family and to have this gender reassignment procedure. And then I remember there was this tiny blip in the media cycle where there was an interview. It was 1 or 2 years after their transition was completed, and they began to express some doubts and some reservations and maybe a little bit of regret. And it was fleeting and evaporated, never to be heard again. And to me, that is kind of indicative of how this whole debate goes. Is we want to make sure that the debate is sanitized so that a unified front is put forth. And if you have any doubts or questions or whatever, you keep them to yourself, because what's important is the agenda.
Okay. Hey, guys, we're going to have to wrap it up here. So let's quickly just go around the room. What was left unsaid, or if there's anything that you wanted to say earlier, go ahead and let us know. If nothing, that's fine. Melissa.
Man, in dealing with this issue and dealing with people dealing with this, who are dealing with this issue, ask questions. I think we just need to ask more questions. We need to listen, ask questions, ask more questions, and just address the heart of the issue from a deeper place, from a deeper spiritual, emotional, mental place. Thank you. Glenn.
Yeah, I would say that to dovetail on what Kevin was bringing up earlier about, begging the left not to do this, I would say, hey, to the folks on the extreme right, leave it alone. It doesn't need to be legislated for an extreme close down as well.
Okay, Jackie.
I guess the only thing I would have left to say on that is that I think that during the course of our discussion today, we've talked about this both from the perspectives of adults that are transitioning and children who say, hey, I don't want to be a little boy anymore. I don't want to be a little girl anymore. And I think there's a world of difference between those two groups, a huge difference. And when the danger I see is when we start lumping them together, nobody's going to win. Nobody wins. And there's no reason for it. So keep your heads on straight, people. Are you talking about the children or the adults? And Lord, be a parent first, not their best friend. Moving on.
Gotcha. Quick word, Dr. Miller.
I think that this really is a great opportunity for the church. Historically, in dealing with issues like homosexuality and transgenderism, the church's response has been, this is sin, get over it and move on. And I think that at some point, the church needs to take a broader and more reasoned approach, not to sit back and say that biblically, suddenly homosexuality is okay, but to sit back and say, we have some profoundly broken people here, and we need to provide a space for them to get unbroken. And I think, that's a lot of what Melissa's doing through her work with the pregnancy centers, realizing that everyone that comes to see her has a tragic story in their background. In the same way with these individuals, many of these individuals have horrible tragedy in their background. And rather than beating them over the head by complaining about their sin, I think that we need to, there's a point at which we need to provide loving grace and help them to get to the root of some of these issues, and showing them unconditional love, not endorsing their lifestyle, not endorsing their choices, but just loving them and helping them to work through whatever struggles and issues they have.
Right. Kevin, what have you got left unsaid today? Which probably a ton of stuff.
Everything the panel said. I really concur that. I would like to tell you all that I wish I were a woman, because every woman I've ever met is 10 times more mature than I am. So,
yeah. Well,
what it is, what it is.
I'm going to talk to you after the show, and we're going to look at some therapy and some counseling for you, Kevin.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't need
Just
surgery at the
remember,
moment.
just remember, Kevin, Chuck Norris was once trapped in a woman's body as well, and then he was born.
Oh,
Think about it. Okay.
Argument solved.
It is so great to have you guys here. I love the insight and the wisdom that we bring, and I appreciate that. Regardless of whether we're talking about gun control, mental health, near-death experiences, souls, we've had some fascinating discussions, and always looking for recommendations. Uh, that'll wrap it up for the Real Squabble. I encourage you, as always, to do your own research, your own homework. Consider watching interviews from those who have transitioned or detransitioned. It's difficult to understand. It's complex, and resources aren't always as obvious as they should be. In the meantime, as we've said, we can continue to demonstrate love and kindness. It's not uncommon to all humanity, as Jackie said. We all share in that. We all want that. We can help others. We can help ourselves have that more, and help others achieve that in their lives too, in a more prosperous way. Offer that support to friends and families. Thank you for joining the Real Squabble.